1. c4. The English opening immediately contests the center and aims for a flexible pawn structure, often leading to complex strategic battles. This move signals intent towards a flexible Indian defense, preparing to challenge White's control of the center and allowing for various pawn structures, depending on White's subsequent choices. This move develops the knight to a natural square, controlling central squares d5 and e4, and preparing for further pawn advances like d4 or e4, a common approach in English opening structures. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop and controls the central d5 square, transposing into many common openings like the queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense, depending on White's subsequent play. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares for a kingside pawn advance, common in many English opening setups that can transpose into various Indian defenses or Catalan structures. This move immediately challenges White's central pawn formation, aiming to open lines and create dynamic play, signaling a transition into a queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian type structure. This move establishes a classical central pawn structure, leading to the queen's gambit declined, where White aims for a slight space advantage and harmonious development while Black seeks counterplay through pawn breaks. This move, b7, develops the bishop to a safe square, preparing to castle and supporting the central pawn structure against further White pressure. Developing the bishop to f4 directly controls key central squares and prepares for kingside castling, while also eyeing the weakened pawn on c7 should Black's pawn structure shift. Castling is a standard prophylactic move, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move solidifies the central pawn structure, prepares to develop the queen's bishop, and avoids weakening the king's side with g3, prioritizing a more classical development. This move boldly challenges White's central pawn formation, aiming to open lines for Black's pieces and potentially create an isolated queen's pawn for White to attack. This capture opens the d-file and challenges Black's central pawn majority, aiming to simplify the position while potentially creating a queenside pawn majority if Black recaptures with a6. Black recaptures the pawn, resolving the immediate tension and maintaining material equality while opening the c-file for potential future pressure. This move supports the central pawn on c5 and prepares to connect the rooks, while also eyeing the d5 square. This move develops the knight to its most active square, preparing to contest the center and potentially support a queenside pawn advance or an attack on White's queenside. This move develops the rook to an open file, preparing to support central pawn advances or pressure Black's position along the d-file. This move develops the queen, challenges White's central control, and prepares to contest the open c-file while potentially eyeing the d4 pawn. This move prevents Black's queen from using the a5-d8 diagonal to pressure White's queenside pawns, and potentially coordinate with pieces attacking the king. This move prepares to bring the rook into the game and potentially support advances on the kingside, while also clearing the e8 square for a possible future e5 pawn push to contest the center. This move prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially f3 or even g4, while also safeguarding the c4 pawn and facilitating further development. This move, 11, e5, initiates a pawn break to challenge White's central control and open lines for Black's pieces, particularly aiming to activate the dark-squared bishop and potentially target White's queen. This move aims to pressure Black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities by exploiting the pin on the knight if black moves the bishop. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn structure and creates dynamic imbalances, aiming to exploit the overloaded nature of the d4 pawn if it's defended without careful consideration. Relocating the queen to b1 prepares to defend the c2 pawn and supports the advance of the d-pawn if the opportunity arises after white recaptures the central pawn. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, threatening the d3 pawn and preparing to challenge white's queen on the b1 h7 diagonal. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the potentially vulnerable black kingside while preparing to support a central pawn push or recapture on e5 if the knight moves. This pawn thrust challenges white's bishop on d3 and aims to seize space in the center, disrupting white's coordinated pieces and potentially creating an outpost for black's knight. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's advanced e4 pawn and potentially reopen the diagonal for the queen. This knight sacrifice clears the d4 square for the other knight to enter the action, and forces white to break their pawn structure with the recapture. The capture recaptures the queen's pawn and activates the white queen, while black must now address the immediate threat to their bishop on c5. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the d3 bishop and potentially preparing for future tactical threats along the a6-f1 diagonal, while maintaining central influence. This exchange of bishops aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses in their kingside pawn cover, while also simplifying the position to white's advantage. Black recaptures the bishop, simplifying the position and opening the f-file for potential counterplay while aiming to solidify their central pawn structure. This knight maneuver prepares to recapture the pawn on c5 while also aiming to activate the knight to a more central square, potentially supporting further central pawn advances or attacking black's queenside. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move initiates a tactical sequence, aiming to exploit the temporarily unprotected knight on d6 by removing the defender and potentially gaining material. This move aims to regain the sacrificed pawn and develop the rook to a more active square on the open e-file, contesting white's advantage. This move re-centralizes the knight after its exchange sacrifice, preparing to challenge black's active bishop and potentially disrupt white's queenside structure. This move aims to contest the semi-open c-file, preventing white from establishing a sole outpost there and preparing for potential counterplay along the file. This exchange is crucial, as white, by taking the rook, aims to simplify the position and reduce black's attacking potential on the kingside, while also clearing the way for the queen to potentially redeploy and create threats. Capturing the rook with the queen stabilizes black's position by removing white's active piece and preparing to consolidate material. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging knights, which should favor white's slightly better pawn structure and clearer piece activity in the resulting endgame. This recapture is forced, bringing the black queen back into play, but it also opens up the e-file and may lead to a queen trade soon. With the doubled pawns on the c-file now gone and material equal, castling kingside consolidates your king's safety and prepares for potential middlegame action. Bringing the rook into play, black recaptures the pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay on the queenside with the newly activated rook. White initiates a strategic regrouping to centralize the rook and potentially challenge black's advanced pawn structure. aiming to exploit weaknesses after the exchange of queens. This move centralizes the queen, creating counterplay against white's potentially vulnerable king while preparing to contest the open c-file. This move aims to solidify the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential king safety maneuvers, while also creating a defensive screen against the opponent's active rook on the c-file. This move aims to improve the queen's mobility and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside after further pawn advances, while also offering more protection to the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to control the b-file and potentially attack black's queenside pawns, while also defending the knight on b3. This move b5 aims to expand on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, while also gaining space and preparing to challenge white's control of the a-file. This pawn advance aggressively challenges black's queenside pawn majority and attempts to disrupt its structure and control of the central squares. This move aggressively challenges white's queen and rook, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially win material by forcing exchanges or creating threats on the queenside. The move aims to simplify the position by exchanging queens, leading to an endgame where white's passed pawns on the queenside might become more significant. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white has a slight advantage due to the more active rook and potential for a protected passed pawn on the queenside. This rook exchange simplifies the position and leads to an endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside, supported by the king, offer excellent winning chances against black's weakened structure. This move begins to regroup the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a pawn advance later in the game. This pawn capture opens the a-file, which can now be used by white to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn. This pawn move aims to create a protected passed pawn on the b-file, potentially leading to active play and a material advantage if white cannot stop its advance. This move activates the rook to the 8th rank, utilizing the newly opened file to exert pressure and potentially trap black's remaining pawns or create mating threats. Black's move of recapturing the pawn with the rook is a sound tactical decision, aiming to consolidate material and simplify into an endgame where the extra pawn might become decisive, although white's connected passed pawns on the kingside still pose a threat. This move activates the rook to the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially targeting the weak b2 pawn. This pawn push aims to create a stronger pawn chain and potentially support a king's side advance, but it weakens the light squares around the king and allows white to immediately exploit the open a-file. Recapturing the pawn on a5 re-establishes material equality and removes black's advanced passed pawn, which simplifies the endgame and removes a significant attacking threat. This move seeks to reroute the bishop to a more active square, potentially aiming for the c3 pawn or supporting further pawn advances. This check forces black's king to a less secure square, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially win material or initiate mating attacks. The king must seek refuge from the checking rook, and moving to f7 prepares to defend the f-pawn and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This knight repositions aggressively to the kingside, eyeing squares like c6 and b6 while potentially supporting a future pawn push on the kingside or reinforcing the defense of white's own king. This timely check forces the white knight away from its defensive post and allows black to consolidate its material advantage. This move is a necessary king repositioning to escape the check and prepare to defend the advanced passed pawn on b2. The bishop repositions to control the long diagonal and support the rook's potential activity on the now open a file. This move forces the black king to a potentially vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt its defensive coordination with the bishop and prepare for further pawn advances. The king must seek safety on the back rank or activate its defensive potential, as it is still vulnerable on the open diagonals created by the rook checks. This move b6 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, a critical strategic objective in this endgame to disrupt white's pawn structure and create new attacking opportunities. The move brings the bishop back to a more active diagonal, eyeing white's b6 pawn and potentially supporting a future a5-a4 advance. The rook repositions to the first rank, preparing to contest the open b-file and potentially trap black's advanced pawn on b2. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepare for potential pawn advances or knight outpost challenges on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, threatening to invade on c5 and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure or attack key pieces. This move aims to reinforce the bishop's protection of the knight on a4 and prepare for future activity on the queenside by potentially repositioning the knight. This move activates the passed b-pawn, aiming to escort it towards promotion and create a significant endgame threat that will tie down black's pieces. The king needs to centralize to defend the pawn structure and prepare for the endgame, as the remaining pawns are on the same color squares as the rook. White prepares to advance the b-pawn with tempo, aiming to create a passed pawn and harass black's king. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it supports potential pawn advances and defends the king. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the b-pawn, while also restricting black's bishop's activity and preventing it from reaching the a5 square. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on h8, though careful calculation is needed to avoid falling into a mating net. Capturing the pawn with the king is a necessary recapture, activating the king into the endgame and creating a more open position. The king steps forward to support the pawns and prepare for potential opposition in the endgame, seeking a more active role. The rook on c8 is now actively attacking the b7 pawn, aiming to either capture it directly or force further defensive concessions from black's king. With the pawn structure locked and the rooks on open files, black's king must become active to support the b-pawn and potentially launch a counterattack. This move aims to improve the king's safety by creating an escape square, preparing for potential exchanges or defensive maneuvers. This move aims to create a potential passed pawn on h5, which could become a valuable asset if the black king is drawn away from the kingside. The rook's retreat to g8 prepares to support the advanced b-pawn, which is crucial for creating a passed pawn and potentially breaking through black's defenses. The king attempts to centralize and support the pawn on f5, a crucial defensive outpost in this endgame. The rook moves to d8, preparing to attack the b2 pawn and potentially create a passed pawn on the b-file, while also reinforcing control of the d-file and restricting black's king. This move initiates a pawn push on the kingside, aiming to create defensive space and potentially open lines for the black king's safety or to prepare a later pawn break with g5. This pawn push aims to disrupt black's rook activity and create attacking chances on the kingside. while also preparing to advance the g-pawn further. The move hx g4 plus is a necessary recapture to open the g-file, aiming to activate the black king and create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king, though it also weakens black's kingside pawn structure. This pawn capture opens the h-file, which can be utilized to further pressure the enemy king and create mating threats, especially after the queen is repositioned to a more active square. The rook on a8 has achieved a crucial outpost on the 7th rank, threatening to penetrate further and restrict black's king and remaining pawns. The rook moves to g8, preparing to join the attack on the kingside and potentially support the advanced passed pawn if it can become a passed pawn. This pawn sacrifice opens a critical file for black's rook to potentially infiltrate white's weakened kingside. The king's central position after recapturing is a strategic advantage, aiming to participate in the endgame battle for the remaining pawns and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. This move repositions the king to a more active square, preparing to support the central pawns and potentially contest the open g-file for king activity in the endgame. rc8 aims to blockade the b7 pawn, preventing its advance and consolidating white's positional advantage. This move aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting the king or preparing to contest the open g-file, while also maintaining defensive coverage. This move opens lines for the remaining pieces to activate and potentially launch an attack on the weakened black king. This checking move aims to disrupt white's king safety and potentially force further concessions or create counterplay, though white's king is already well protected and black's own king is vulnerable. The king is pushed forward aggressively to a central square, aiming to participate actively in the endgame and support potential pawn advances, a critical strategy when material is reduced. This pawn move advances black's passed pawn, aiming to create a decisive advantage by promoting it on the kingside, forcing white to commit their remaining pieces to its defense. This pawn advance on e5 aims to gain space in the center and restrict black's king, potentially creating a passed pawn on f5 if black captures. This move is a brilliant attempt to create tactical complications, forcing white to defend against a potential mating net or loss of material by leveraging the king's exposed position and the rook's activity on the open file. White's king must return to defend the pawn and prepare to support its advance or to prevent black's king from reaching critical squares. This forcing check aims to disrupt white's king centralization and potentially improve black's rook activity, while white will likely respond by moving the king to a safer square. This king move aims to activate the monarch in the endgame, preparing to support the pawns and potentially challenge black's king for control of key squares. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay and exploit white's exposed king, but it ultimately fails to achieve anything concrete. This knight move activates a dormant piece, bringing it to a central square where it can support the pawn push or prepare for potential kingside activity while defending against checks. This move forces the white king into a more active, but also more exposed, central position, while simultaneously creating a passed pawn on the queenside for black that will be difficult for white to stop. The king must retreat to safety on the back rank to avoid further checks and prepare for pawn promotion.